So for matrics, we've been looking at the main mechanisms that drive evolution, which is natural selection. But it's important to look at other mechanisms of evolution as well, and we are on page 278. And the first alternative mechanism that plays a very important role in evolution is that of gene flow. Gene flow will come up again later on when I describe to you how we make a new population, a new species. So for now, let's just bank this word for a little bit later on. But effectively what gene flow is a movement of genes between populations, and gene flow can be affected by migration. In other words, in order for a population to remain a singular species, there needs to be gene flow. And that means the individuals within that population have to be able to interbreed with one another as much as possible. But there are sometimes geographical forces that separate populations from one another, or migration separates populations from one another, and that then limits the gene flow. And the moment you limit the gene flow in a population, you can cause evolution to occur. Not because there's no gene flow, but rather the changes that happen in these two separate populations who are unable to interbreed with one another then reduce the gene flow between the two, meaning any new changes that might happen aren't mixed between the two populations, and those differences can slowly accumulate into one large macro evolution, which could lead to a new species. And a good example of this is illustrated here, where we have a population of deer, and there's some kind of geographical barrier in between them. And let's say for now, the western deer and eastern deer population, they are the same species. They have different coat color, but they are the same species for now. And this little pass that's in between the mountain range allows the western deer and the eastern deer to mix with one another and to share their genetics with each other, and that's the gene flow. But what would happen if this pass that sits in between the two populations, what would happen if this disappeared? Maybe it filled up with snow, or there was a rock fall, and that then prevented the western deer population reproducing with the eastern deer population. Now remember, they're just two separate populations. They're not separate species yet. But when you cut off the gene flow with a geographical barrier, you allow these two populations to experience their environments separately from one another, independently of one another, and that could lead to mutations arising, or it could lead to different environmental favorability, meaning that perhaps the eastern deer population favor their environment better because of their color of their coats. And if they accumulate enough of these changes, there's a possibility that these two populations become two different species. Maybe the western deer don't change too much and they stay as the original parent population, whereas the eastern deer may change over time and become a completely new species. So the next mechanism of evolution, other than natural selection, is that of polyploidy. And polyploidy is when you have a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of your set of chromosomes. In other words, you're not just 2n, you're 3n, 4n, 5n. It basically means you inherit a full, complete extra set of chromosomes. And this is quite common in plants. Very common varieties of plants that we actually eat that are polyploidy are things like wheat, cabbage, and broccoli. And a lot of that has to do with our domestication of plants and making them the best possible versions of themselves for our benefit. And I'll come back to that later on in this video about how we actually get to these ideal wheat, cabbage, and broccoli versions through artificial selection. Another very common example of something that we eat that has polyploidy characteristics is bananas. Bananas are seedless. Well, the ones we eat today are seedless. Originally, bananas had seeds, but what we've done is in creating polyploidy bananas, we've reduced their ability to reproduce, which means we've taken away their ability to make seeds. And that's one way we make seedless varieties of plants and seedless varieties of fruits. Now, it is not very common in animals, but it is actually found in goldfish and salmon, and they are examples of organisms, of animals that have exhibited polyploidy characteristics, and they have the ability to carry more than one set or an extra set of chromosomes. Now, the third and final mechanism that's associated with evolution is that of genetic drift. And genetic drift is a random change in how frequent a characteristic occurs in a population. And this random change is due to perhaps something like a natural disaster. Even though today we closely associate natural disasters with climate change, which is ultimately human influenced, when I'm referring to natural disasters here, I am referring to things that are not due to human influence. And so, for example, a landslide, a hurricane that would normally occur, a tornado, a tsunami, something that effectively can wipe out an entire population and remove all of their genetics. And that can lead to extinction, but it can also lead to evolution. And this is the one and only time random chance comes into play with evolution. And very often in documentaries or people describing evolution, they throw this word random around very often, and it sort of makes it sound like evolution is literally random, and it's not. There might be a change in the environment, but that change is not random. It's all systematic. It's one big system that's influencing each other. And so when we speak about anything that's random in terms of evolution, the only thing that's random is ever going to be a natural disaster. You can't predict that happening. Another little example, which is just illustrated in this image here, is we have a population of beetles that are brown and green. And let's say, for example, this is the only population of these beetles. This is it, okay? There's no other populations on Earth. If we were to introduce even a human stepping on two of them, and now randomly that's happened, by accident it's happened, or even if it wasn't a human, even if it was a landslide that killed this green beetle population, we've now randomly chosen to have more brown beetles, not because the brown is better, not because nature selected brown being more favorable. It was literally a small change, like a natural disaster, that has selected a new favorable characteristic. So to further illustrate genetic drift, we're going to use this bottleneck effect explanation. And I'm going to use something like a tsunami as my natural disaster. So if we look at our parent population, you will notice that our organisms are yellow and blue, and they're somewhat of equal proportions to one another. It looks as though they're about the same amount. And now our natural disaster occurs, which creates this bottleneck effect. And the thing about natural disasters is they don't select favorable or non-favorable characteristics. They kill and remove equally. In other words, you are lucky enough to survive that natural disaster. And so if you look at the picture, whoever makes it through that a neck point, that bottleneck, whoever makes it through that and into the grass at the bottom was lucky enough to make it through and survive the tsunami. And so now if you look at the contents of that glass, you'll see that there are more blue than there are yellow. Now, that doesn't mean that the blue were better at surviving the tsunami and the yellow were less better. It was down to pure random luck that whoever made it through and whoever survived the tsunami, it happened to be more of the blue than it was the yellow. And the next generation, they reproduce, and you can see the contents of the bottle. There are a lot more blue than there are yellow. Now, here's the beauty of natural selection, which was our first mechanism, and also the beauty of evolution. Even if a tsunami occurred and it wiped out the majority of the yellow population, as we can see in this bottle, if the yellow was the favorable before the natural disaster and it continued to be the favorable trait after the natural disaster, nature would continue to favor it and it would return back to being the favorable characteristic. In other words, it would return back to being the most frequent characteristic within the population. And so even though maybe now there might be more blue than there are yellow, you would give the population a few generations and it would go back, it would revert back to its original state. Either the blue and yellow are of equal portions, or if, like I said earlier, the yellow was more beneficial, then or more favorable, they would then go back up in numbers. And that's the beauty of natural selection, in that the environment will correct itself regardless of external factors that might be more short term, like a disaster. A natural disaster is more short term in the grand scheme of geological time. This slide is just specifically on a video that I found that was quite interesting. Does the theory of evolution really matter? And they really unpack the mechanisms of evolution and whether or not the products of evolution matter. And so I'm going to link this video in the Google Classroom so that you can watch it at your own discretion. The final topic that we're going to look at today is artificial selection. And this is obviously a natural progression on from natural selection. And we're going to look at how humans have selected our own favorable characteristics and how we've actually sped up evolution and it occurs a little bit faster. So what exactly is the aim of selective breeding? Selective breeding is the mechanism that we use to select what we want. And what we do is we alter the average phenotype within a species by selecting certain physical and behavioral traits that are beneficial or desirable to humans. And when you write this description in your final paper, if they ask you what artificial selection is, you need to make sure you include that it is an animal that is being produced with desirable characteristics for humans. This does not happen in nature the way we're going to describe it now. It's humans that are doing the selecting for what we want. And we are doing this to increase a certain trait's frequency, meaning we want this favorable trait to occur more and more and more as the generations continue. And we also do this by maintaining our new desired breed. And what we do is offspring that don't have the desirable trait are not selected for breeding. In other words, if there is an animal that is not producing my desirable trait, let's say it's a chicken, and it's not producing lots of eggs, I'm not going to let that chicken reproduce. I'm not going to let its eggs get fertilized, and therefore there's going to be no more female chickens from that lineage that are going to be able to lay eggs and reproduce. And what I'm doing is I'm selecting the chickens that have the highest amount of egg production, and I'm going to let them make more babies, more offspring. And the ones that don't lay very many eggs, I'm not going to let them reproduce because I want chickens that make as many eggs as possible. And farmers have selectively bred plants and animals for lots of different functions. It doesn't necessarily have to be for eating only. It can also be for companionship, something like dogs, which I'm going to explain very soon as well. But I want to use, for example, cows. How does selective breeding work with cows? So let's say I have a group of cows producing and yielding milk. If I want to be a dairy farmer that produces the most optimal amount of milk possible, I'm going to take my cows that produce the most milk daily, and I'm going to let them reproduce. Those cows that don't make a lot of milk are not going to get to reproduce because I don't want those genes to be passed on. I want the best milk producing genes to be passed on. So I reproduce those cattle, and they make more female cows, and those female cows make a lot of milk, and I continue to do this. And anyone who doesn't make enough milk, they can't reproduce, but those who make lots of milk, I let them reproduce. But here's the beauty of artificial selection and continuous variation, which we mentioned in an earlier video. What I can do is not only can I just keep the ones who make a lot of milk, I can actually increase how much milk they make by reproducing them with only cows who make a lot of milk, and actually I can accumulatively increase their milk production. In other words, because of continuous variation and there being a variety of milk that can accumulate over time, that means that a parental cow maybe produced 1 liter of milk a day. Their offspring now produces 1.5 liters. Their offspring now produces 2 liters. And then their offspring produces 3, and so on and so on. And so what can happen is certain characteristics can be largely exploited, and the yield of milk, for example, can be greatly increased over the generations. Now, this doesn't take very much time, and so artificial selection can take fewer generations to get successful breeding to take place. Another example can be something like maize plants that are grown faster, and perhaps they grow bigger cobs, and so that they produce more. And humans have been doing this kind of selective breeding for thousands of years. It is not a new thing. It's actually technically the first example of genetically modified organisms. They're GMOs. And so when something is labeled as a GMO today, I don't think a lot of people realize that we've been genetically modifying foods for thousands of years. And the truth is, there are very, very few foods that we eat today that are not truly genetically modified free. If you eat a tomato, regardless of what the label says, it's probably genetically modified. Likewise with wheat and corn. The corn we eat today is due to roughly 4,000 years of evolution from South America and the Mayans, who genetically modified the food to suit their climate, to suit their farming and harvesting habits, and ultimately gave us the corn we eat today. Now, a very common example that we are very familiar with that I would just like to use as an example of how artificial selection works is with dogs. Now, the 4 dogs on the screen are all the same species, but they look very different. Different sizes, different fur colors, different fur textures and length. Even their behavior is different. Their temperaments are different. But what humans have done is we have selectively bred dogs in order to produce different characteristics. Now, what's really interesting is that every single physical characteristic that you see in a dog has come from wolves. So when you look at a wolf, you don't think of a sausage dog. You don't think necessarily of a Dalmatian. But what's interesting is wolves carry all of those genes. They carry long and short hairs. They carry all those different colors and the spots and the different temperaments. And so what happened was, to make it a very short story, wolves lived alongside humans for quite some time. About 10,000 years ago is when we first started living alongside wolves. And there were a few wolves that were a little bit better tempered, they weren't as aggressive, and they didn't mind eating our scraps, living on the outskirts of our settlements. From there, we used to start feeding these ones that were living nearer to us because they kept predators away. And slowly but surely, we made them man's best friend. And we did this by selectively breeding. We chose wolf pups that were less aggressive, that were more alert. And over the course of only a few thousand years, we produce the hundreds of breeds of dog that we have now. And they all have different fur colors and different textures and sizes, but they also have different jobs. Different dogs had different purposes. Some were protectors, some were hunters, and even some were purely for companionship. But dogs are the perfect example of artificial selection that has been done by humans. What's one more little piece of interesting information is even though dogs are a different species to wolves, they are just close enough in evolutionary time that they can actually still interbreed with one another. And so that's why I mentioned in a much earlier previous video that there are some exceptions to how species must be able to interbreed with themselves and cannot breed with other species. But there are some exceptions to those rules depending on the evolutionary time and how closely related they are in the first place. To finish off our artificial selection story, let's look at the origin of some of our vegetables that we may not necessarily know all came from exactly the same plant. And that is the wild mustard plant. Today, the wild mustard plant has produced very common vegetables like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. They're all linked to one another. They are all from the same ancestral plant. Now, looking at the ancestral plant, the wild mustard plant on the far left with the yellow flowers, you wouldn't say that it had the ability to turn into these 6 varieties of leafy green vegetables, but they had. Why? Because the wild mustard, the original generation, the parental generation, they had all of these characteristics in there, and there was variation. Some wild mustard plants might have had more bulbous outgrowths, which they could have used to create Brussels sprouts. Perhaps likewise with broccoli, the florets that grow at the end of the broccoli, the part that the majority of us are familiar with and we eat, that could have been more prominent in some of the wild mustard than in others. But I want to just stipulate that this would have taken time and accumulation of change. There was no original broccoli that we see today back in the beginning of the wild mustard times. That would have been a gradual change over time. The broccoli plants would have got bigger and bigger and bigger and would have looked more familiar to us. I also would like to point out that the wild mustard plant is still alive today as you see it in the picture, and that means that all these varieties of plants are very closely related to one another. That then concludes today's lesson. We've had a lot of information, and I suggest that you really take your time to go through all of this work, to consolidate it, to do the activities, to ask the questions that need to be asked in the next day's lesson. These mechanisms are really important for our upcoming topic, which is the formation of a new species. That is going to be an important video to watch.